Hello, and welcome to the So Emotional podcast. Here on the cast, we discuss everything emotions through the lens of attachment, the nervous system, and internal parts work. We're a little irreverent and like to have fun exploring the emotional issues and dynamics that interest us. So come along and hang out. Let's explore the fascinating lands of emotions. Welcome to the So Emotional podcast. My name's Nick Carl, and I'm here with Angela Wetzel. So Emotional podcast, we talk about emotional stuff. Angela is a coach of all things emotional and life and business. And I am Nick Carl, and I practice somatic experiencing, trying to get in the body and get in emotions. And today we're going to talk about navigating ups and downs. A little bit vague, for sure. We're trying to encompass some things, right? So the seed for this one was I was working with a body worker. She does counterpoint. They just call it Counterpoint. And as she was sort of she pushes on my head and then pushes here and stuff. Many things, it's like energy is moving in my body. And a couple of times, it comes up and it is like a rush. It's like a flood. And I've noticed that this has been happening.
Can I cut you off a little? Because I want you to set the stage of your last one, because I just think it's funny.
The stage of the last one.
The points, she found one point and then what the other point was, and just pushed on those points.
Yeah.
The towel thing.
Yeah. Well,
if you want to share it. Actually, you don't have to share it.
No, it's totally fine. It's totally fine. But yeah, you're right. There was a part of it. So it's I don't know all the points. And point and counterpoint, she actually starts by getting a reading from the skull, and then we look for tenderness, just tenderness. Is it it's oh yeah, it's a little tender. Tender is tenderness, which is kind of a vague thing because sometimes it can be ow, very tender, and sometimes it's I don't know, maybe, I don't know. It's hard to tell if it's tender. She works through different things, and then she references her book, and then finds out kind of what circuit it is, what part of the body we're working with. And in this particular session, we were working a lot with somatics. It had been a couple of weeks since I seen her, so we're working with the ANS, autonomic nervous system. So the arousal stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And at some point, and it referenced somewhere else. She was working up here, and then she's like, okay, well, we got to do this other one. So flip over, and she's like, okay, this is root, not root chakra, but root nerve, right? Mm-hmm. Which is right on my tailbone. And then so she finds the spot, and she does a press and gets a reading. And is that tender? It's yes, that's tender. It's tender right there. She's like, okay, this is a towel one, which means that to get the counter strain, which is to relieve the pressure on that particular part, she's going to push in somewhere else. And this place was actually perineum based, which is I'm relaxed. We've sort of done this before, but anyway, so she's relieving strain, and she had kind of her hand on the top of my on the top of my hips. Whatever she was doing, it felt very comforting. It was very relaxing. I was like, oh, okay. It's of course my mind is okay, we're gonna get our butthole pressed now. But it was but it was very relaxing. And as I relaxed into it, and it was the biggest one of the whole session, this giant wave that came into my body, and I'm laying face down, and I almost kind of arced up, and it hit me, and it grabbed me just for a moment. I think that if it had been the first time that something like that had happened to me, I think it would have very much startled me. But this is not my first rodeo. But as this energy hits me, I just breathe, and I just let the impetus come into my body, and then just do what it is there to do, and then leaves. And it felt extremely relaxing. It was there was it is like a fist. There was a holding there, and then there was a release, and I could totally feel that, right? But in that sort of exercise and that happens probably a dozen times during this hour-long session of things coming in me and me having this kind of pull back reaction or holding almost, and then it just going through. And I felt like I was actually getting better at that. Like as I get sort of triggered or have these sort of like, uh, you know, white knuckling moments that I could relax. And that like that process of being okay with that happening, not getting so frightened, is continued to get better as I have continued to meet those reactions inside myself with compassion. Like
Right.
that it's okay. And I've noticed that the same mechanism happening in other places too. Like in
I
our,
had a quick question.
sure.
So when you're involved in like this practice, like counterpoints, like something like that, a session
Okay.
or like coaching or whatever, and when you notice those feelings, the feeling comes up, and then there's like the white knuckling. The white knuckling, you feel like, is a subconscious response to, like, it's almost just automatic, and
Yeah,
then the
absolutely.
releasing of it, is that a conscious thing that you're doing, or is that also like subconscious?
I think that that's tricky because it happens really fast, but I do think that it is more conscious. Like it's the thing that I have to do. It's
You
like a
practice
switch.
releasing it.
Right. So very similar thing happened yesterday with more of a negative tone, but I had a consultation with a client, and at the
Mhm.
end of it, I thought that it maybe kind of didn't go so well. And I had a lot of like just, they almost felt like shocks. It was like, oh, of shame really is what it is, right? Shame
Mhm.
of like, but it happens so fast, but it's just like these like, and I could allow that to like stay and be like, oh God, like oh, ugh. But I continually have to sort of like be like, no, it's okay. No, you're okay. It's okay. I'm still here, and it's interesting the perspective of how it actually like how it happens on the inside because when it is happening, it is kind of full. It takes up the full picture, right? It covers up my whole consciousness because it's a very bright energy, right? Like it takes up the whole thing. And it happened on the table a couple times. Actually, I thought, like, no, like I said it to myself in my own brain, this is just happening in my body. And that was interesting because just in that moment, like, oh, no, I'm a person. It's just happening in my emotional body, in my body. And I was able to get just a tiny little bit of separation, which was super helpful.
Mhm.
But in this, go ahead.
Sorry to, oh, I just was noticing because I was taking part in a coaching session. Like I was, I'm part of this coaching group,
Yeah.
and I was being coached today. And I felt a part of me come up that is like really vulnerable, like it doesn't like to be seen.
Hmm.
And so there was like some emotion that started coming up, and just like the awareness that I was being looked at.
Hmm.
And then there was another part of me that kind of like stepped forward and like kind of pushed this other part back, and I was like, just so, like I was cutting off from my emotions because I did not want to be emotional or feel emotional or be like seen.
Mm-hmm.
And so I noticed that happening today, and I'm realizing it's the same kind of thing where it's like having like a certain vulnerable feeling or an emotion comes up that like wants to be expressed or is at least like present, and then that other kind of like protector part that is like showing up to provide resistance to that. And anyway, it just made me think of that because that happened today.
Right. Something something similar to that. I can remember this was years ago, but I just remember that it was so stark, and I don't. I wasn't practicing the same kind of like internal awareness that I try to do now, right? To whatever ability that I have, which is I have no idea. But I could remember that I was in a situation and I was sort of like desperate, and I began to cry Okay. And I began to cry like really hard. And because it was so fierce, the crying that started happening, another thing came up and just closed that crying door like really hard. And it was just
Mm.
like, it was like somebody just like flipped a switch and it just all went away. And I was just like, I was kind of startled by that, right? Because because of the situation, I thought like it would have been right to cry, like because that's what I wanted to do. That's where I was. But this other part of me, like swooped in and was just like, nope, whoosh, and just like cut it all off. I was just like,
Mm-hmm.
whoa, that was that was pretty interesting.
Were you alone or
Yeah,
were you?
I was alone.
Okay.
So I don't know, navigating. So we were talking about navigating ups and downs, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
I think that there's so many different kind of so many different types of scenarios and ways that our insides can act and react to how things come into us, right? So there's, I don't know, the activating of something like that, so it falls under the triggers category, right? And then, uh, like, I think in that case, like, uh, it's, I always think about in terms of reflections and projections, right? So it's like you're put into a situation where it's reflecting something in you, which is eliciting this emotional response. And then, depending on your relationship with it, it will have different kind of like outcomes or like how it actually expresses, you know?
I'm trying to like, I know what you're saying because we talked about this earlier, but we were talking about there being like three, maybe like four different parts of the or of this equation. Like one is the actual like trigger or the nervous system response to whatever has happened. So there's like a reaction of some sort. And that is like the visceral bodily reaction. And then there can be an emotional thing that comes up to like emotions that are kind of separate. And then the interpretation of that, like the perspective. And is that what you mean by the projection and reflection part?
Yeah, well, okay. So I think that on the table, when I'm doing body work with my person, I really think that she's operating, and it makes sense. She's operating on the physiological level, right?
Mm-hmm.
And she's able to because of her skill and the thing that she does. She's sort of like moving energy around, right?
It makes
And
me
that,
think of like acupuncture meridians too,
yeah,
because like
for
I
sure.
remember when I used acupuncture, there were different charts they would have on the wall, and there would be like the perineum or the anus would be on there, and I'd be like, seriously, like they had little like points, and I always thought that was really funny because I'm really mature.
So,
Uh,
so, like when she's moving energy around, there was like some kind of emotional component, but I think that was like less of a component. Whereas, um, so she's moving physiological things around, then energy moves, and then there's some emotional component to it. When I'm laying on my bed alone crying, like that seems purely emotional, which then like has a physiological reaction then to it, right? It's sort of like chicken and egg, like what comes first, is it the thought first and then the
right.
emotion and then the physiological thing, right?
Right, heavily debated and
Right,
like
heavily
what the word,
debated.
because sometimes you can have a thought which then triggers an
Right,
emotion which then triggers
right.
like
Okay.
this reaction, but you could sometimes just have a trigger which would then cause like an emotional response even before you have a thought or anything about
Right.
it. Like
Because
it can
right, and
happen
have
really
absolutely
fast
been in
together.
that where from what I can remember, the first things that I started to have in a particular situation was an emotion, right?
Mhm.
And then like I get into this like emotional state. This has happened a few times, and this is one of the scenarios that I thought when I thought about talking about this topic was I had a friend in town and wanted me to come see him, and like it bothered me. Like it was just like, so the first thing, it's because it's totally within bounds of regular fucking shit. And the first thing
Right.
is like, like that's the first thing. So it's like the triggers an emotion first, and then like I start having thoughts, which is like, you don't give a fuck about me, you just sort of like bored or something, and you just want something to do. You don't give a shit about me, and it
Mm-hmm.
goes into this whole sort of narrative, which then, I think the emotional and the physiological part, because it was like all the feelings that I had from the emotions, like how it affected my body, probably whatever it does to my cortisol levels and all that bullshit.
Mm-hmm.
But I think so. There's this interplay of the body's energy, the emotional energy, and then you, the person making the meaning out of both sides, right?
Yeah. So it's like how you're interpreting everything,
Yeah, how you interpret the
like the play
data
by play.
that comes into your consciousness moment by moment, right? And one of the things that was really mind blowing, really uh, revelational to me in my process of like learning about, trying to learn about insides and emotions and feelings and thoughts, was the idea of like parts work, right? And so it was actually working with that trigger of this person coming into town wanting to see me and having a very like negative reaction, because that wasn't the reaction with this person all the time. It just seemed to be, it had happened a couple of times, but so I just worked with it because it was pretty easily accessible to me, because I like I felt used, like I didn't feel special, I felt used. And so the way that I experimented with it was, where I live, I drive a lot, so I'll have these hour drives, and I began to just say words to the feeling, you know, and kind of out loud, like So I got real worked up just thinking about it and feeling and thinking, and then I was just like, like, it was like, fuck you, and you just like, you don't give a shit about me, like I'm nothing to you. Everybody's just trying to like get what they need. Nobody gives a fuck about me, And I was like, and through that monologue or dialogue or whatever hell it was, sort of it was revelatory. It was like, oh, that's how you feel. That's really interesting. And like at the time, like being introduced to one of the things that we talk about a lot about is IFS, internal family systems, right? And parts work. Your inside of you is a big round table of sort of like consciousnesses, right?
Or we could call it parts con, and maybe they're not at the round table, but some of them are like stuffed in hampers, and some are in closets, and
Sure.
some are like chained up and shackled and
And this
chained
one,
to the radiator or whatever.
this one I called transactional boy. Okay, and transactional boy was like, nobody gives a fuck about me. Everybody is out for themselves. Nobody loves anybody. Everybody's just trying to get their cheese, right? Everybody's out there just out there doing their shit, and nobody gives a fuck, right? It's all just one big fucking lie. And that sort of story came with a very specific emotional tone, right? So that's what it was. It was just kind of
Mm.
a way of seeing the world. And when I had experienced what I call transactional boy in the past, before I kind of learned more about him and learned like what he thought, I just thought that that was me. I just
Mm.
thought that that was me. I and I could, and as I went back through the past with this like different lens, it's like, oh, that guy's been around for a long time.
Mm.
You know, it's like, oh yeah, he he's popping up here and there, and like whatever kind of gets him, and really it's about like just not feeling taken care of, like people aren't putting in the effort to like take care of me, like recognize like what I bring to the table, and thinking that I'm special, right? That I have value, like there is something divorced in that.
Mm.
And when I did that, it was just like I was like, oh wow, okay, yeah, that's really interesting, which I thought was a really I don't know, it was revelatory to think that here's this, you know, before parts work, and I don't see this as a negative, right? I just thought that my experience of me was just me, and that
A unified mind, like a one experience, like
yeah,
you're all of these things.
yeah, and there was plenty that has happened in my life that I couldn't explain, right? And I guess I just shrugged my shoulders and been like, oh, I guess it just wasn't right, or however I could explain it away, didn't
You
seem
mean
like.
like relational outcomes, like and
Sure, yes,
just
relational
like
outcomes, or even like how did we get into this fight? You know, how did
mm,
this conflict begin in the first place? That stuff really just kind of whizzed by. And if I'm like hating somebody or like feeling a certain way about somebody, I didn't really second guess it. It's just like, nah, that's just the way I feel. And in hindsight, it ends up being very black and white. It ends up being very
mhm.
uh, sort of like fatalistic. It's like if it's not this, then it's that. It was.
Right. It's so fascinating because, you know, I've been doing parts work for like, gosh, I think it's been like a few years now,
Yeah.
like being coached and coaching in it. And I even had some like part recently where I realized like that I had become identified with that I didn't question as a part.
Mm-hmm.
I just sensed that there was something different from how I used to identify, and I didn't fully understand why I wasn't identifying with that anymore. And I remember when the shift happened because it actually happened around some deeper trauma that had happened. This had to do with my retinal detachment. And this new part had showed up to keep me safe. And so around that time, I couldn't feel my passion for acting. Like I kind of went like I felt like I was numb in that area, and that was really unusual for me because I've always identified and really loved performing and like pursuing acting and just all of those things. And then it just went away, and I was like, I don't understand what's going on here. And so it's interesting because we can have, because of trauma, deeper like foundational cracks that are kind of more under the surface. But when we have new traumas that happen, it's like those those cracks become like giant like chasms. It can like kind of break something wide open. And so even in areas where we think like, oh no, I'm good, or thinking that this was the big trauma, it's actually just the fact that there was already like weakness or vulnerability there that has been further complicated by like these new pressures or new circumstances. And that's something that happened with me, and I didn't understand exactly what had happened or why that trauma was so um had affected me like in the way that it had,
Mm.
like that deeply. Like I didn't understand all the parts that were at play,
Mm-hmm.
and how deeply um how deep all of that stuff went. Like it was like many layers down of different parts and vulnerabilities that were pre-existing that just became exacerbated by this one event that seemed to like cause a giant like fracture, you know, because it was like linked to so many different things. Yeah. But it's I guess what I'm saying is it's interesting to have awareness around being identified with parts and like how sticky that can be, like how even awareness that we're not that feeling or that we're not that perspective isn't in and of itself a practice to cultivate, because it's so easy to just take that for granted, that that perspective or that emotion or that limited way of thinking or seeing the world is in fact a like a staple or a permanent part or permanent fixture in our personality, when that's really not the case. Like it's like these parts have entire personalities of themselves and like subparts or different, like fractals too. And it's just really interesting to think, and you had mentioned this earlier, and I thought that was a really good point when you said that we can feel joy and that's still a part. It's like these aspects of our personality can experience like these ranges of emotion. And the other interesting thing that learning about parts work is that parts can become enlightened, that they actually like self-actualize and they can mature and grow up, and that it's never about getting rid of the part or shaming the part or being like, oh, I'm just not going to need this part anymore. It's more like integrating it and bringing it along, and in effect, like inviting it to have a seat at the round table instead of it being trapped inside a closet or, duct tape over the mouth with those zip ties, just like sit down and shut up. You're causing trouble or whatever.
When I first heard that, like in the idea of parts work, that the formation of the part comes from something in the past, okay, which seems a little bit abstract, but actually made sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the idea of the my friend who's in town who wants to see me, right? Because I've known that person for so long, and you know, I couldn't place there wasn't he hadn't done anything really out of bounds. I could tell that I was different in that moment, that I was
Mm-hmm.
having a strong emotional reaction to this particular request, right? So just the idea of like that emotion that I was having now was actually born somewhere in the past.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that is activating it now and bringing it to the fore is a reflection, because of it mirrored something about the original scenario, right?
Mm-hmm.
About the original, like the original scenario of like how it came to be, right? And that I don't know. I thought that made a lot of that just made like a lot of sense to me, So to think
Right.
that to think that here I am, and maybe a day before or a week before that I had started to do the work, that I wouldn't have second guessed it.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I, you know, did the work of showing up and like communicating with it and learning more about it, it actually made a lot of sense to me. Like, oh, okay, no, there's a lot here, right? There's a lot of like almost consciousness there that was just looking to be sort of met, right? And that is
Mm-hmm.
like it needs to be taken care of.
It's so fascinating because it's those early incidents and maybe perhaps repeated incidents that necessitate that aspect of our personality to be formed to meet an unmet need, or it's like there's a purpose, like these parts have a purpose, like a very special purpose, And that's to basically survive, basically make sense or meaning of what's happening so that we can change our personality or feel like we have some sense of power in an otherwise powerless situation. So for that part, it's like perhaps it was recognizing that you weren't really going to get the love that you needed. And so it was like conserving your resources and being able to view love or relationships on a transactional level so that you could conserve your energy, maybe for things that were more like generative for you in that circumstance, whatever like would help meet that need more. And maybe that was like not a human connection. Like maybe it allowed you to conserve your energy towards something that you were actually able to get like some form of reciprocity from or good feeling from, right? So it's like a protective and important part. And I think it's also really easy for us to look at these parts from other parts and like shame them or be like, oh, this is irrational. Like, what, you know, silly, like this doesn't make sense or, you know, whatever. There's like these other like critic parts or analytical parts that make interpretation judgments about these other parts. And even they serve a purpose because as these personalities form at different ages, it's like, if this strategy doesn't work, this first strategy isn't working so well, then it's another aspect of personality pops up to navigate that energy or those circumstances in a different way. And it's like those younger parts like never really go away. And so in my instance, and I think you've probably felt this as well, where you've had these younger parts that are literally like screaming somewhere, but they have like the hand over their mouth or they're kind of shut in somewhere and they're not given a voice and they're literally revolting. And it can feel tricky to getting that other protector part to like loosen its grip so that there's expression allowed, because sometimes those younger aspects of our personality like got us into trouble. Like the intention was to you know, whatever, keep us safe, protect us in some way, but that it ended up getting us like punished or rejected. And so then another strategy, another aspect of personality pops up to then like mitigate whatever new information or new circumstance has popped up. And I think what's been interesting for me is noticing that I didn't always necessarily question that protector part or that critical, like judgmental part, and just assumed that the more emotional, like chaotic part was like not acceptable. Like, oh, of course, yeah, that's ridiculous,
Yeah,
you know?
you can't have big emotions.
Right, which is like just mirroring a lot of the messaging that I was getting just around being able to express emotions, just like raw power, just full passion, whether that's crying or throwing a tantrum and just being angry or however I was feeling.
Where do you think where are the where are the parts when they're not here?
I think they're always there.
So they're always there, and where
I
exactly
think
are they?
it's a good question. I think that, so I view the parts thing as like, so like our mind, right? Our like mind, it's not necessarily like we store all information in our mind, which is really weird because like we have the pineal gland, which is like a radio transmitter. And then we have like our emotional bodies or like energy bodies, because it's like, it makes me think that it's almost like where thoughts are stored, that some parts are stored like in our muscles and our fascia, like these holding patterns. Because the other interesting thing is that when you're talking about being on that bed and being, you know, manipulated in those ways as pressure points, that you're having this emotion rise up, and then another part, so there's one part that's having like the emotional reaction that's just happening,
Yeah.
and then the other part that's like wanting to resist the expression of that, which I think happens with like everyone every day, like all day long, you know, like don't feel the thing, like don't do it, right? And so we literally have these two like warring parts where one is like, I want to be expressed, the other one's like, no, like pushing it down. And I think that it's very challenging to think about how exactly those processes work. But when I work with clients, I think about how these being able to see these parts in our mind's eye, like calling it up that way, is a process of like using imagination, but also like symbolism, or um, just using our consciousness in a way that is representing how our neural pathways are set up.
Right.
And so when I think about and like, I honestly don't know what the answer is. I'm just like spitballing since you had asked. So I'm just guessing. But I imagine that these like exiled parts of us are sort of in these like exiled neural pathways where there's not a lot of connections being made. And so they are very physically alone in the dark where they don't have connection.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes the first time that we encounter some of these parts, or we're aware of them, truly is finding them in an isolated place, like in our mind's eye, where they're usually like hunched over, or they're crying, or they're sad.
Right.
And it's likely mirroring some of the actual body language and physicality of perhaps when that personality was formed.
Yeah.
And also might indicate like some of the circumstances around when it was formed.
Right.
And also the fact that these younger parts feel alone and isolated, and that technically they also are, like if you were to do like a neural map of how many like synapses and connections are going to that part and the kind of energetic resources that they have. So I view it as like how our brain is just able to come up with like ideas and imagination, but that it's like the brain, the body, the imagination, like none of it's truly separate. So I don't know if I answered that question. How much of that is
Maybe some, but you know what it made me think of is that absolutely, without a doubt, that when though, like thinking about that, transactional boy, when transactional boy is forged, right, when he's made, right, there is no safe place to have those types of emotions, right? So that like doesn't exist besides maybe just like in protest and being mean and sort of like sideways, right?
right?
Yeah. There is no like safe place for expression. And so and I know this full well that like our bodies have the ability to take a thing and to disassociate it, right? To like push it down, to push it away, especially if there's no avenue and no safe place
Right.
to do it. It's just like,
Right.
nope, we can't do that. We have to take this thing and we have to get
Right.
rid of it.
Like
Like we
we
have to bury it.
literally don't have the skill set or the resources. Like we don't have a person,
Right.
we don't know how to handle this. So it's just got to go away because it's too
Just
much for
gotta
right
go
now. It's
away.
kind of like compartmentalizing it, just
Right. And then,
stuffing it.
when we use our imagination to try to interface with that, like I think the parts structure and how we abstract it and like how to use our imagination is just I think it's a good and effective way to bridge that gap into the space of where our body can store these things, right? Wherever that is in our being, whether it be in mind, in our fascia, or like in our actual like tissues, whatever it is, wherever it can exist. And I think that thing, it's, I think that was one of the most. It absolutely was one of the most like eye-opening piece to me, right? in doing my somatic experiencing work, which I've mentioned before, it felt like I had discovered an ocean in my backyard. Like that here's this
Mm,
part of me that's right here that I didn't know was there, that absolutely is affecting me, right? That has all this energy for me, that is bleeding out of me, but that I hadn't necessarily connected with. And it wasn't until I started getting into my body to see that there was, wow, that there's a lot of energy here. Wow, a lot of it is pretty, negative or negative emotions, that just, and then when I started to put together all of my daily practices for keeping that at bay, right? All of the things that I did, which was essentially my entire personality, was just keeping things sort of down. And even all of those activities uh, couldn't do it. They still leaked out.
mm.
And
It's a
I
lot of
still,
energy to hold those things down.
sure.
Yeah.
So my next question for you is that like, so okay, so we have these parts or pieces of these disassociated things, these energies in our bodies, whatever we want to call them. But as I began to work with them, and I think you can see this too, but begin to recognize when something like that is in the present. It's there, right? I know one of the things is like when you and I are having a conversation. I'm sure you have pointed it out many times, but I will like stop talking, right? It's like something has entered the room, right? And usually this is where I use the language of reflection. So you have said a thing that has like painted this little emotional picture, which has reflected down past that barrier of not being able to see, down into my being somewhere. And then something has arisen, which is an emotion, right? Which is a part that is now here, right? There's a new spirit has entered the room.
So you're
New,
saying it's like through somebody noticing something, like reflecting that back to you, is like calling that part forth or calling that part out.
no, what I mean to say is like what I want to get into is like how we start recognizing the types of situations when a part is, say, present, that you are now, that your
Mm,
consciousness is now under the influence of a part, right?
right. Well, so we mentioned this earlier about like, because we're not here to necessarily get rid of these aspects of our personality,
No, not at all.
right? And it's like mostly it's about supporting the parts of ourselves that feel neglected and misunderstood and that are suffering and in pain. Because if we were to have children, we would notice, because it's very external, like 3D person,
Yeah,
small human being, that they're suffering, especially if we're very sensitive and attuned,
yeah,
that we can see like, oh, this child needs help, or this child is sitting in the corner and
right,
they just stare at the floor all day, like clearly
right.
something's not right. So I guess in any case where it's emotion or that suffering that's negatively affecting our quality of life or how we emotionally want to feel every day, then it's getting curious about like what's there and how to reach down into the abyss and offer a hand to help heal those things. But I guess to answer your question, how do we know when? I would just say it's being able to notice those energetic fluctuations, like noticing that you're triggered becomes an art, because you want to start to pay attention to whether you're feeling like you're in a state of arousal, which I think most of the time people think of like sexual arousal. I'm aroused, but it just means like your energy is now
Yeah,
suddenly being stirred. So
your hackles are up.
yeah, like be feeling prickly, cranky. I mean, like I had a post that I did on Instagram a while ago where it's just like lists of just different triggers, and there's so many different ways that we can, like, signs that we've been triggered, because it is literally noticing your nervous system and what it's doing. You can feel like you want to faint, you want to puke, you want to punch someone in the face, you want to run, you want to have sex with someone, you want to smoke a cigarette. Like you start to feel your palms get sweaty. It's like noticing your physiological or visceral reactions to what's
Right.
happening. And it's noticing whether you've gone into fight, flight, freeze, fawn mode, or whether you've slipped into some kind of freeze depression. And you can
Yeah.
also tell just by the emotions that you're feeling when you start to feel funky in some way, because generally that arousal or immobilization, like they don't feel optimal all the time. So it's like when you feel really shitty, it's likely that you've got a trigger going on, or you have a certain emotion that wants to be expressed that's actually being repressed.
Right.
So it's usually resistance to feeling that's causing the uncomfortable stuff to happen, and or your body being like, there's literally a tiger and you need to run now,
Yeah.
but we don't think about that.
But so I'm, and I don't remember a specific thing. I just know that it's happened when you and I talk sometimes. But like something will happen, I will get triggered, then I will stop talking. Like I wish that like some beautiful
Mm,
mother from the sky could come down and just like when it happens right away to be like, oh honey, what's going on?
mm,
You know,
mm-hmm.
what's going on with you? Use your words. And then could be
Yeah.
like that in the moment because things happen pretty fast sometimes. That it's just like it can come in and it can go, or sometimes it can stay. I think one of the tricky ones for me is the freeze type stuff, right? Because it's just like psh, mind kind of blank. It's just kind of foggy, fuzzy.
Yeah.
Fuzziness. It's like that one's hard to get into. Like,
Can I interject something that you said?
yeah,
Because I really like that you said that. You said, I wish there could be some mother from the sky that would come down and ask if you're okay. Like they're there, but you can actually cultivate that like an aspect of
yeah,
yourself. Like you can create that part or a future part.
right,
Because like parts there, like we can also have past parts, we can have future parts. There's even something called legacy burdens where it's like generational parts.
right,
So it's like the parts where it can get really interesting because it's just kind of like archetypal work where we're noticing or creating characters in different ways, or just tapping into different like emotional energies or ways of being that we want to express to ourselves.
right.
And so that just gives me some insight that a quality you're really needing and wanting to feel is a very nurturing mother quality that's like very soothing
Right. Yeah.
and calming.
Yeah. Um, I know that like my internal dialogue, or honestly, it's like the energetics of it. Like there would be plenty of times where I would be triggered, and then I would notice it, and it would just be like, no, no, like fighting it off, right? So instead of a wonderful, beautiful,
Mm.
nurturing mother energy from the sky, it's like an annoyed 14-year-old, like, shut up, you fucking idiot, just like, no, this isn't, no, that kind of shit,
Mm.
which is not that's a pretty abrasive, like, internal, like,
Mm.
Freudian. It's like, what is that? Superego, right? Superego is like the embodiment of your parents' own energy, right? So however you were sort of like treated as a child, you like treat your own children, right?
You treat yourself that way
You
and
treat
you also
yourself that
treat
way,
your
right?
children that way.
And so there has been a softening, right? And it's not perfect, but
Mm-hmm.
that it is there, that it's like, you know, a thing will happen, like with the consult the other day, and I was feeling pretty shitty about it, It's like, showing him, be like, it's like, hey man, it's okay. It really is okay. You're gonna be okay. Like,
Yeah.
you know, you're safe. Nobody has anything on you. Uh, you know, we can take care of this. We have support. We have friends. We have people that love us. We, can be safe here in our house, and we don't, nobody can get us. We're okay here. And I did that. Internally, and it's still. I had a few like reverberations of the same energy as I went to sleep that night. I've even had a couple today, just randomly. Like they had a very specific like energetic signature, right? Of just like
Mm-hmm.
oh, which I've heard that called a flashback before.
Mm-hmm.
I've heard that called, which is like in the
Like aftershocks.
right. God. So sometime when I was a kid, me and my brother, I was pretty young. So there was somebody walking. It was dark outside. We had a big front yard, and this guy was walking out on the sidewalk. I thought it'd be fun to take my slingshot. We had slingshots at the time, so we're like 8, 9, 10 years old, and shoot it near the guy to get his attention, not to hit him, just to be like get his attention, to get him to look at us. And of course, I'm good up with my slingshot. And I just shot near him, and so we did that, and he just turns right around, comes down the sidewalk, walks directly up to both of us and says, "Give me those." Takes the slingshot from me and my brother, knocks on the door, gets my mom, and then just like reams us a new one. And it was just like the most shameful, like just like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And, like that happened when I was 10. Whenever I would remember that, it would just be like a shock. It would just be like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, throughout my entire life.
Mm.
So it kind of reminds me of that shit yesterday. I'm just like, oh shit, oh God, oh God, oh God. Ugh, ugh.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry. Side story.
No. I was trying to think of what I was gonna say something. I can't remember right now. Um, I think something that I was thinking of, like when these yeah, working with clients, like it's always fascinating with the part stuff and how the energy shows up, because it's not even necessarily like tied to language. Like it's images and like colors and temperatures and visceral feelings and like memories and different things that show up to kind of
Hmm.
um is like the way in.
Hmm.
um like Richard Schwartz talks about this as like a trailhead, like how you kind of find your way into these parts, because they have, like some parts are like nonverbal, like pre-verbal, different ages, and he said a
Right.
lot of them are under the age of 10. um but it's really interesting, because the kind of symbolism and metaphors that come through is so fascinating. Just like anything from there being like a baby that's like out in the desert and is like getting scorched by the sun. It just depends on like the person and what their imagination or what like these energies have associated to that wound or that pain,
Mm-hmm.
or even like trying to paint a story of what those circumstances were, or even what that energy felt like. So it's just that was one thing I was thinking of. But the other thing I was thinking of is just how to offer these parts, like what are they really needing? Because they have a certain job that they're doing. It's not necessarily that they want to do it. It's like out of necessity, they show up energetically in this way. And the other thing that I see a lot is like, I would call it an authentic energy, but I only call it an authentic energy because it's kind of a masking or like a shell type of energy, where it's like, and I see this a lot with really driven, like a lot of the clients that I work with are kind of these like high performers, like really purpose driven people. Like purpose matters a lot, like doing the thing they want to do in this world. And usually they're getting tangled up by relationships, and they want to have both purpose and relationships, but there's
Mm-hmm.
like some mess happening with both, and like neither are working that well. um and I just forgot what I was going to say. um Something about oh yeah, like what these parts really need. And it's, oh yeah, the inauthentic energy being, especially like for the female clients that I work with, they can, in their home, like they needed to step up and like fill in a gap where like, one or both parents, they weren't stepping up, or they figured if something had to be done, like that they would have to do it. And so it might not have necessarily been how they would have naturally responded had they had, ample support, and this goes for everyone. But what I'm noticing, or what I've noticed, is that some of these women they'll like step up to fill in these energetic gaps, and then they have all this masculine energy that they've cultivated, but it's come from a wound or like a necessity where they just like kind of self-sacrificed or just like stepped into this role, and then it defines them and they think that's who they are. But then when it comes to getting into relationships and dating, they're finding that they might emasculate or intimidate men, or they don't know how to receive, and it's because those parts or those personality aspects like had to show up in this certain way that is actually not how like their natural energy really wants to show up. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so it's like learning to listen to the parts to understand what those deeper underlying needs are, like what the truth is, like who they really are, as opposed to like how they show up like when they're wounded
Right.
or in a wounded state.
Yeah, because I think that it's natural and generative for human beings to be in connection. Absolutely, right?
Mhm.
But when you get close to other people, your parts that you are either aware of or not aware of, and their parts that they either are aware or not aware of, will begin to interact, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely, right?
Mhm.
And I think to a layperson, and to me, say 5 years ago, I guess I just interpreted all that as just fate, It's just like, oh, it's just the way it
Mm,
was, just wrong person, wrong time, right? That's
right.
because that's all I had. There wasn't really anything else for me. One thing that my brain would do, because my parts weren't being attended to, uh, and I don't know, this is just my how I would do it, is that I would begin to make essentially like an internal list of all the things wrong with the other person, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Which is just like they don't do this, 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 and this, which therefore makes them, you know, fine, but not good enough for me. Not in my life.
Right.
Just like whoosh, get out of here.
It's a very common
Yeah, I think it's like
like intimacy stopper. It's
yeah,
like, oh, I will disqualify this person so I don't
that's right.
have to get close, or I don't want to deal with their shit, aka I'm not dealing with my own.
Right. And like it does start to be like, you think like, okay, I've been through 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 scenarios, right? And they all end the same. And what's the common thread here? And it's like, oh, it's it's me. And so
Yeah.
like that becomes clear, but still without
Mm-hmm.
being able to uh, being able to know and to feel and to be aware of some of the internal energies and the internal structures, right? And the internal parts that are there and that are at play, right? It wasn't until I was in the car screaming at my friend that I learned about what that part was, right?
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't until, you know, I did a lot of somatic experiencing where I met, Armageddon boy, right? Just wants to destroy everything. Uh, and, there's more and more. And then there's sort of like the interplay. Uh, there's like, there's absolutely desperate boy, desperate for love. And then another part that's like, that's fucking gross, You like,
Mm-hmm.
that's gross to be that desperate, Just like all these back and forth. Um, that it's been really cool to like know that more, and show up. But like you like you said, so you've had these, you talked about the women who like embodied and had certain strategies and showed up in certain ways, and then not knowing, right, that they actually made those agreements, right, or showed up in that way,
Mm-hmm.
not reflecting for safety and like for pragmatic reasons, right?
Yeah.
Made all these choices, but then how that doesn't work in other situations.
Right. Like it works perfectly for the context. So these parts were very like the person makes sense in the given environment, but you take them out of that context, like you take them out of the home of origin, and you grow them up so now they're in adult bodies, but
Right.
their emotional selves have not aged,
Yeah.
and you put them in a new context and like different surroundings, and you could be like, this person makes no sense. Like we could judge a person, be like, oh, they're weird, this, why are they doing it, doesn't make any sense. But if we're able to be curious enough, then we can be like, oh, well, this person actually makes complete sense.
Yeah.
We're just not seeing them in their original context. We're not seeing all of the circumstances that created this person.
Right.
And it's interesting because like there's not a disorder. Like actually everything is in order.
Mm-hmm.
Everything, every adaptation, every way the brain developed and the body developed was to stay safe and loved and protected
Mm-hmm.
and get those needs met. But then when you grow up and you leave and you're no longer in that context because time has changed, and we become somewhat frozen or stuck in these behavioral patterns,
Mm-hmm.
we find ourselves wanting to create something different than maybe this hell that we were living, depending on if your childhood was pleasant or not, or mixed with what, pain and
Right.
pleasure.
Right.
And it's like we are still acting like we're there because all these parts, they don't know that we've grown up, and they don't know that there's like more than mom and dad, or more than just mom, or whatever the situation is. They don't have the latest like newspaper or whatever.
Right.
Like they just have no idea how old you are or anything. But when you're trying to form new relationships or just trying to adult,
Right.
it's like these younger parts are still driving the bus, driving the car like into the ditch, because it's like the ditch was where it's safe. So
Right.
if you want to create something different, it's like you have to learn and understand what's going on, like underneath, like what's really happening, so that
Right.
you can
So
actually create something different.
the work is a deep inventory, learning, interaction with our preconceptions, right? And like for me, the energy that is helping me most right now is uh, with compassion, like in care and love. That seems to be like a kind of a universal, to treat myself where I find myself with the reactions and with the emotions that I have, right?
Mhm.
And that's like still absolutely like an ongoing practice that I'm not great at. Like I can absolutely still get caught up and lose my perspective, lose my like adultness, lose my uh, seat in strength and my ability to adapt and make changes and show up and to do good for a situation. I can
Yeah.
lose perspective and take perspective of that part, that preconceived part that sees the world in a very particular way, and usually one that's kind of exacerbated, you know, put in a bind and in a hurt place.
Yeah. We don't necessarily have a ton of control over when we go unconscious, because that's going to happen.
Yeah.
But consciousness is something that we can cultivate, being in the present moment, in the present awareness, like with our capital S self,
Right.
grounded in this present moment. And then um, just gently bringing ourselves back to there, or however long it takes to
Yeah.
get back to that moment. Because like sometimes you have a trigger and the part comes up and you're aware of it, or it's not super sticky, or you're able to unidentify so you can hold space, and that's
Right.
a matter of hours. Sometimes you just don't even know that it's a part.
Sometimes, like I feel like, you know, so for my last big splash into, so, and this is something we talked about before, is this idea about being blended. Okay. So, and the idea of being blended or enmeshed, people use different words, is that you get triggered, this preconceived emotional consciousness from the past or from another life or something comes into your being, right? And that you lose your capital S perspective. And for a moment, you become this part. You are the part, and you see the world through its uh, through its vision, which
Mhm.
is very sort of crunched down into a very this is the way that life is,
Super black and white
super black and
thinking.
white, and that can happen for a moment. It can happen for an hour. It can happen for a day. It can happen for a week. I think it.
Years, like
Yeah.
lifetimes. It could be a whole lifetime where you
Sure.
go in and out or just operate, just not having the conscious awareness
Which
where
is
you're fully identified, because these
it,
parts are super convincing.
yeah, and and I think, which is a little bit scary to think about, honestly. It's just like, under what grip am I still now, this very moment? Because there's still like forces, like I'm a little speck wandering in the solar system,
Well, so it's really interesting, right? Because there's like a certain flavor to saying that. Like what forces am I under kind of sounds a little bit like
Ominous?
yeah, like being a puppet. Like, am I just a puppet? Like, how aware am I? And then, you're reminding me of the speech that Jane Lynch gave. I forget at some graduation where she talks about the fact that we actually make decisions like 8 to 10, I think it's seconds before we're even consciously aware of those decisions. So it's like, how do we really know like what part of us is in the driver's seat? And
Sure.
like, is it fate, or do we have any real conscious choice, and how
Yeah.
much,
Right.
so it's like a whole
Yeah.
it's like
I
a
know.
whole
I know it's a
Pandora's
whole
box,
thing. Like I
can of
think about.
worms.
I always think about it as a river. Like you're in the river, right? You're in the river of our society, of our country, of our planet, of your family, of your friends. You're in the river of time. And like I've told you this story before, but it's like, what if you were born in outer space, just alone, unto yourself, right? It's like you have nothing to reflect off of, right? You
Mm.
have like nothing there. You're just a consciousness is all that you are, you know? And so like I spent some time in Canada a few years ago, and one of the things that it's just I don't try to do it, but I of course it doesn't take but a few days. I start to like speak Canadian, like with a Canadian accent. And like I was
Mm.
not trying to do it, but I could feel that like I like to do it because it's like I'm modeling what's happening around me. There's just a very natural thing, that like, oh, you laughed at something? Well, I'll laugh too, because I guess this is funny. We're
Mm.
signaling each other all the time, right? We're
Yeah.
responding to our environment from all these signals, right? And these signals come
Hmm.
from also inside quiet places of these pieces of our consciousness and our being that have been stored in another dimension, right? This is like the wildness of it, like that there's voices and there's information just like floating around us all the time, and like how do we orient ourselves to that? How do we sort of like make sense of like, okay, where am I on the ladder, or where am I in the river? It can get like
Mm.
it can there's
Right.
more questions than there are answers, but
Right. Like I'm being influenced by neutrinos and these like light particles of information that are passing through
right.
me, and then the stars and the generational trauma and like how my DNA has been encoded with these things. And then also like even the microorganisms, you know, that are like trying to order, you know, like giving me cravings like they're at a Sonic drive-through and suddenly I'm, you know, I want French fries and like a milkshake, right? So
Yeah.
it's just really funny to think about all of the little parts like consciousness that we're like made up of, and just having awareness of all those things. And it's like how much of this is really us,
Right.
you know, and like there's personality pieces, and then there's like the capital S self, which
Right.
is, you know, maybe just like the witness, which is a silent observer that is actually not, doesn't have personality. It like
No,
is
it's
part of
just
timeless
is.
awareness. It
Right.
is. It's like I am the
Yeah.
trippy.
So somebody told me this, which is just I'm being influenced by somebody, so I'm just repeating something, but it's with what I'm going with now. Okay, so
Okay.
this is my decision point that I'm going with now, and whatever, it's not revelatory,
Mm-hmm.
whatever, but it's try to go with in any time that I can make the choice. It's to try to go with softness. It's to try to go with compassion. It's to try to go with like curiosity and like listening, like you know, I've heard you say it before that like no emotions are wrong. You know, there's nothing wrong. They're just messages, and I think that's
Mm-hmm.
like a great place to like start a conversation. You know, uh, to not try to force anything away or push anything away, or to be mad at yourself for thinking anything or doing anything. You know, it's just to like notice, be curious, and like have an open heart to something. You know, anything that's happening. You know, imagine yourself as that compassionate parent and you are the child of, you
Mm-hmm.
know, of yourself, you know, seeing you there in the grip of this thing, and you want to just be there so that they're not alone, you know that they have help, you know, that we aren't alone in this universe or even with ourselves, you know, that like that it is okay. And that's that's the choice point that I try to get to, and I'm not, you know, perfect at it at all, and I shit on myself plenty, right?
Yeah.
But when I can, in the right spirit, and I sometimes can, like I can gift myself that, and it feels really good when I can.
Yeah, I think anytime we have resistance going on, resistance to anything, we're introducing contraction, which is then like tightening and closing down. And that's where the discomfort is. But also in like the birth, life, and death cycle, it's a series of contractions and releases, right? So it's like we can't be released and open all the time. We can't be like this all the time. So it's like
Right,
trying to find the balance of
right,
feeling, you know, maybe meeting the resistance and doing your best to like allow it to open
right.
again.
Almost like a
And
breathing.
then yeah, it's like breathing, it's like giving birth, although I haven't experienced that personally, but
Remember Alan Watts
it's
would
a
talk
rep.
about the warp and the woof, you know, it's just the basic yin yang.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, it's yes, the yin yang energy, the the two parts of that, the whole.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, and I that quote has been in my brain since I don't know for a while, but one of my favorite quotes of all time, Carl Jung, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate.
Uh huh.
So I believe we only have as much control over life as we have consciousness to be like aware of it. And
Right,
then even then, it's still participating in that, like using power instead of force to align, and then practicing like movement and surrender, like when to participate and when to relax in the river, like
mm-hmm,
allow yourself to be moved by inspiration, you do. And
mm-hmm,
then so it's like it's just like finding the balance
mm-hmm.
in everything.
Yeah. Dig it.
Is that it? I think that's it.
I think that was pretty good. Anywho, thanks for tuning in if you stay with us through all that. Uh, leave a comment, subscribe, do the thing. We'll try to be responsive and, listen and talk about things that are brought up, Check us out on Instagram. We got the Epic Initiator, which is Angela, and I am Gnarl Kick. Say hi, say hello, and that's that. We'll catch you on the next one. Sound good?
All right.
Bitch it.
All right.
All right.
Bye.
Later.